Paris, August 25th, 1944. General Lieutenant Dietrich von Choltitz, the German military governor of Paris, sat in his headquarters at the Hotel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli and listened to the city fall around him. He had been ordered to destroy it. Hitler's instructions had been explicit, repeated, and increasingly hysterical across the final days. Paris was to be left a ruin. The bridges over the Seine were mined. The cultural monuments were targeted. The city that had been the crown of the German occupation in the West was to become, in its liberation, a funeral pyre, visible from the advancing Allied lines. Von Choltitz had not detonated a single charge. He would surrender the Paris garrison within hours. He would later say, in various formulations across a long post-war life, that he had spared Paris because he could not bring himself to destroy it. This explanation satisfied the historical narrative. It was also incomplete. The fuller explanation was simpler and more brutal. He had looked at the American advance rolling toward him across the French countryside, the columns of vehicles, the aircraft overhead, the supply trains that seemed to have no end, and he had made the calculation that a professional soldier makes when the mathematics have become undeniable. There was nothing left to destroy Paris for. The war in the West was already over. The German strategic debate about the Allied invasion of France had consumed senior commanders for 2 years. Where would it come from? How large would it be? And the question that everything else depended on, could it be defeated in the critical first hours before it consolidated a beachhead? Rommel, commanding Army Group B, believed the landing had to be destroyed on the beaches. His experience in North Africa had taught him what Allied air and sea power could do to a force attempting to maneuver in the open. Once the Allies were ashore, once their supply system was established, once their vehicle columns were moving on French roads at that point, Rommel believed the battle was over. His argument was not defeatism. It was logistics. The Allies could sustain a campaign on French soil indefinitely. Germany, under the conditions of 1944, with its rail network under constant air attack, its fuel production degraded by Allied bombing, its replacement pool depleted by 3 years of catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, could not. Rommel was overruled. The Panzer reserves were held back from the coast. When the landings came on June 6th, the initial German response was paralyzed by a command structure that could not agree on whether the Normandy landings were the main event or a feint designed to draw reserves away from the real landing at Pas-de-Calais. By the time that question was resolved, it was too late. The Allies were ashore. Their supply system was functioning. The vehicle columns were moving. And the campaign that followed from the brutal attrition of the Normandy hedgerows through the catastrophic German defeat at Falaise to the pursuit across France that carried American forces from the Seine to the German border, 6 weeks was not the campaign that German strategic planning had anticipated. It was something different in kind. Something that German officers who survived it would spend decades trying to describe accurately, reaching, repeatedly, for the same vocabulary. It felt, they said, like fighting a force of nature. It felt like the advance would never stop. The moment the character of the American advance became undeniable did not arrive on June 6th. It arrived 7 weeks later, on July 25th, 1944, when Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy bridgehead, began with a carpet bombing so dense that it briefly killed and wounded more Americans than Germans through short drops, and then unleashed General Omar Bradley's First Army into the open country south of St. Lo. Within 48 hours, the German defensive line in that sector had ceased to exist as a coherent structure. The speed of what followed stunned everyone, including the Americans conducting it. General George Patton, given command of the newly activated Third Army on August 1st, drove his forces south and then east with an aggression that the German command structure, still oriented toward the now-collapsed Normandy front, could not track in real time. The 4th Armored Division, the tip of Patton's spear, covered 60 miles in the first 4 days. By August 10th, Patton's forces had reached Le Mans. By August 19th, they were at Argentan, closing the southern jaw of the trap that would become the Falaise Pocket. German Corps and Army commanders trying to respond to this movement faced a problem that was simultaneously tactical, operational, and existential. Tactically, the problem was finding Patton. His columns did not advance along predicted axes. They moved toward the least resistance, changed direction when resistance stiffened, bypassed fortified positions rather than reducing them, and trusted their supply chain, the Red Ball Express, air delivery, pre-positioned fuel dumps to keep them moving, when a more logistically cautious commander would have paused to consolidate. General Hans Eberbach, commanding the German Panzer Group West during the Falaise battle, described in post-war interrogation the specific frustration of attempting to establish blocking positions against Patton's advance. We would identify his direction of movement, move forces to intercept, and find upon arrival that he had already gone somewhere else. Not because of intelligence failure on our part, because he moved faster than our response cycle permitted us to follow. Operationally, the problem was fuel. The German units tasked with counterattacking the American breakout were operating on fuel allocations that were, by August 1944, a fraction of what mobile armored operations required. The panzer divisions that should have been the instrument of a decisive counterattack, the hammer blow that German doctrine promised could stop any advance, if applied at the right moment, with sufficient force, were moving toward their attack positions at night, in small groups, to avoid Allied fighter bombers, consuming irreplaceable fuel in approach marches, and arriving at their attack positions with insufficient reserves to sustain the operation. The 9th SS Panzer Division, ordered to counterattack toward Mortain in early August as part of Operation Lüttich, arrived at its attack position with approximately 40% of its authorized fuel load. It attacked anyway. It failed, partly because of the fuel shortage and partly because Allied air power destroyed its leading elements before they reached their objectives. The Mortain counterattack, Hitler's attempt to cut Patton's supply lines and reverse the American breakout, was the last serious German offensive effort in France. It failed completely. And its failure did something to the professional understanding of the German officers who had planned and executed it that no previous failure had quite managed. It demonstrated that the doctrinal solution, the concentrated counterattack at the Schwerpunkt, the decisive blow at the enemy's vulnerable point, was no longer available as an option. Not because the Germans lacked the will to execute it, not because the officers planning it were incompetent, but because the material conditions required to execute it, adequate fuel, adequate ammunition, air cover for the approach march, time to reconstitute between engagements, did not exist and could not be created within the timeline the advance allowed. General Günther von Kluge, who had replaced von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West in July 1944, and who bore the impossible burden of attempting to conduct a coherent defense against Cobra with forces that were being destroyed faster than they, could be replaced, wrote to Hitler on August 21st, 2 days before his own death, by suicide, after being implicated in the July 20th assassination plot, a letter that was the clearest statement any German senior commander produced of what the advance actually meant. "My Führer," he wrote, "I have seen in the field that when an engagement is lost, it is lost. Nothing can change this fact. The troops fight with the greatest courage, but the unequal struggle is approaching its end. In my opinion, it is necessary to draw the proper conclusions from this situation." The proper conclusion was surrender. Von Kluge could not say the word. He was a product of a system in which saying the word was equivalent to treason. But he had looked at the American advance and performed the arithmetic and arrived at the answer that the arithmetic demanded. The advance would not stop, could not be stopped. The war in the West was over. The numbers that describe the American advance from the Normandy breakout to the German border are not just impressive. They are, when placed against the German capacity to respond, a portrait of two systems operating in different realities simultaneously. No army in the Second World War covered equivalent ground against organized opposition at comparable speed. Not the German advance into France in 1940, which covered similar distances, but against an opponent whose command structure collapsed in the first week. Not the Soviet advances of 1944, which were conducted against a German army already broken at Kursk and Bagration, with supply lines measured in hundreds of miles rather than thousands. The American advance was sustained mobile warfare at pace, against an opponent who was attempting serious resistance, maintained across 50 consecutive days. These losses were not recoverable on the timeline available. The 15 divisions destroyed at Falaise represented a core of experienced, equipped, organized fighting power that the German army in the West could not replace before the American advance reached the Rhine. The supply comparison. The Red Ball Express, activated August 25, 1944, delivered an average of 7,000 tons of supplies per day to forward American units during its 83-day operation. Peak delivery on its best day exceeded 12,000 tons. The entire German logistical capacity in France and Belgium in August 1944, rail, road, and horse-drawn combined, was capable of delivering approximately 3,000 tons per day under favorable conditions. By August 1944, conditions were not favorable. Allied air interdiction had reduced German rail capacity in France to less than 30% of its June 1944 levels. Actual German supply delivery to forward units was running at figures that German quartermaster officers described in internal reports as incompatible with sustained defensive operations. An army that receives 7,000 tons of supply per day advances. An army that receives less than it needs to hold its ground retreats. The arithmetic was that simple. German officers had experienced defeat before at Stalingrad, in Tunisia, in the grinding retreats of the Eastern Front. They understood defeat. They had been trained to manage it, to extract the lessons, to rebuild and return. What the summer of 1944 produced in the most honest German officers was something different. It was not the psychology of defeat, it was the psychology of irrelevance. Defeat implies a contest in which you did your best and the enemy did better. The German officer who studies a lost battle can identify the moment where a different decision might have produced a different outcome. He can point to the turning point, the missed opportunity, the resource that arrived too late. Defeat, in this sense, is still a conversation between two professional soldiers, in which skill and decision and the friction of war were the decisive variables. What Blumentritt and von Kluge and the corps commanders watching the advance from their increasingly untenable headquarters were experiencing was something that did not offer that consolation. They were watching a system, and a system does not make tactical errors that a better positioned enemy can exploit. A system does not have a Schwerpunkt that can be identified and attacked. A system does not run out of momentum after a decisive engagement. A system continues, day after day, with the impersonal regularity of a process that has been correctly engineered and adequately supplied. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division through the Cobra breakout and the subsequent retreat across France, described in post-war interviews the specific moment at which his professional framework collapsed. It was not a dramatic moment. It was an administrative one. He had received, through his intelligence officer, an assessment of American supply deliveries to forward areas for the preceding 48 hours. The figures, thousands of tons, moving continuously, arriving at the front faster than his own units could consume what they had produced in him, not anger, not despair, but a kind of professional vertigo. I understood then, he said, that I had been fighting the wrong war. Not the wrong enemy, the wrong war. I had been fighting a battle of skill against a battle of weight. And battles of weight do not care about skill. Battles of weight do not care about skill. It is the most precise description of the American way of war in the summer of 1944 that any German officer produced, and it contains, in 8 words, the entire argument that this channel has been making across every script. The American advance after Normandy was not faster than German doctrine expected because American generals were more brilliant. It was not more sustained than German defensive operations because American soldiers were more courageous. It was not more lethal than anything the Wehrmacht had faced before because American weapons were categorically superior in design. It was all of these things and none of these things, and something larger than all of them combined. The full expression of a civilization that had converted its productive capacity, its organizational talent, its logistical infrastructure, and its institutional investment in the individual soldier into a single, integrated, continuously operating military system that did not stop because it did not need to stop. It had fuel, it had ammunition, it had men. It had, behind every advancing column, the arsenal of democracy running 3 shifts. The strategic consequences of the American advance from Normandy to the German border in the summer of 1944 were not limited to the ground gained or the German forces destroyed, enormous as both were. They were consequences of a more fundamental kind, consequences that shaped the final year of the war by determining what Germany could and could not do with the time and territory and manpower that remained. The most important strategic consequence was the destruction of the Wehrmacht's operational reserve in the West. The 15 divisions lost at Falaise, the additional formations shattered during the pursuit across France, and the equipment losses that could not be replaced before winter. These losses forced Germany into a purely defensive posture in the West that it would never escape. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall, Hitler's pre-war defensive fortification along the German border, became the fallback position, not because it was the planned defensive line, but because it was the only defensive line left after the retreat consumed everything else. Even the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's December 1944 counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the last German strategic initiative in the West, was shaped entirely by the losses of the summer. The force assembled for the Ardennes offensive was the largest Germany had managed to put in the field in the West since Normandy. It was also, qualitatively, a shadow of what had been lost at Falaise. The SS Panzer divisions that spearheaded the attack were rebuilt around cadres of veterans, with new equipment and new recruits. They fought hard. They achieved surprise. They drove 50 miles into the Allied line before being stopped. They were stopped not by a superior defensive plan, but by the same system that had driven them back from Normandy. The supply system that could redirect thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel to threaten sectors faster than German columns could exploit their breakthrough. The air power that cleared the skies the moment the weather permitted, and the artillery that never ran out of shells. The Bulge failed for the same reason every German initiative after Normandy failed. It was a battle of skill against a battle of weight. And battles of weight, once the weight is sufficient, do not reverse. The German border that von Choltitz had seen in his mind's eye as he stood in Paris on August 25th was not a final defensive line. It was a final resting place. Dietrich von Choltitz spent the remainder of the war as an Allied prisoner. He wrote his memoirs. He gave interviews. He constructed, around himself, the legend of the officer who had saved Paris, the man who had chosen civilization over orders, who had looked at Hitler's instructions and found in himself the humanity to refuse them. The legend was partly true. He had saved Paris. The bridges stood. The monuments survived. But the deeper truth, the truth that von Choltitz himself acknowledged in his most candid moments, was simpler and harder and more instructive than the legend. He had looked at the American advance and done the arithmetic. The arithmetic had one answer. Not today, not in the Hotel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli, not in the ruins of a city that the war had already passed, not for the sake of an order from a man who had stopped being able to read a map, not against an advance that would not stop, could not stop, had been engineered since 1940 in the factories of Michigan and Ohio and California to be the kind of thing that did not stop. The German officers who watched the advance and called it impossible to stop were right. But they were right for reasons that went beyond the tactical and the operational and the strategic reasons that reached back to every decision, every investment, every social choice that had produced the system they were watching. The women who had built the vehicles, the teenagers who had riveted the planes, the logistics officers who had moved 40 million tons across an ocean, the doctors who had given every wounded man, including the enemy's wounded, the same blood and the same penicillin. The army that had sent its soldiers ice cream in the snow. All of it was present in France in the summer of 1944. All of it was moving east toward Germany. All of it was, from the perspective of the officers watching it, impossible to stop. They were right. It did not stop until Berlin.